Hi everyone, my name is Erna Sif Arnardóttir. Today we're going to talk about acute and chronic sleep deprivation. So the learning objectives for today is to be able to recount, discuss and evaluate the outcomes of acute and chronic sleep deprivation. So what happens if we sleep too little or poorly? Sleep affects the whole body. So sleep is very important, of course, for the brain, but it's also important for other bodily functions. And if we review the different effects it has, so when we are poorly slept, and those who are regularly poorly slept, for example, choose to sleep too little, they are at increased risk of accidental death. And the reason for this is that, for example, you're more likely to be in a car crash because you have impaired brain activity and you have cognitive dysfunction. Your memory is impaired and we are more moody when we're poorly slept. I'm sure you have experienced this. It takes less to make you annoyed or make you angry than it does when you're well slept. We are also more likely to be depressed or anxious if we are poorly slept on a regular basis, and we're more likely to have any type of accidents. We are also more likely to start yawning, and yawning is actually something you should never talk about or do when you're giving a talk, like I am doing now. See what happens with you now that I am talking about yawning. Have you started yawning yet? You may feel, it's amazing how you can start feeling sleepy just because someone else is sleepy. It can be quite contagious. This is actually due to the mirror neurons in our brain, where we are imitating each other and copying each other. It's quite fascinating. Another thing that happens after some days of not sleeping is that we start hallucinating. And this can happen. This is actually very important for people who are, for example, bipolar and people with schizophrenia, for them to be stable and not go into mania and psychosis is to have good sleep. So one of the triggers for the mania and the psychosis can be not sleeping well or staying awake for some nights. Another thing that starts happening if we're poorly slept is we start getting microsleep. And this basically is your body taking over and you fall asleep involuntarily. And this can happen when you are listening to a talk or you're watching TV. And this is maybe not so bad. But of course, it is much worse when this happens, for example, when you're driving. We also can see quite clearly effects on the body, like our immune system is weakened when we are poorly slept. And there are some strong studies for COVID that show, for example, that the immunization for the vaccines was not as successful in those who are poorly slept. So it affects our likelihood of getting the cold, different flu, different infections, and our response to deal with infections. There is also a connection with type 2 diabetes. So if I would, for example, measure your blood sugar and insulin levels in the morning when you have been well slept, you slept for your 8 hours, everything was fine, and I can see your levels are normal. And then I would measure you again tomorrow, and you would only have 4 hours of sleep. We can see that the insulin is higher. So you actually, you start getting insulin resistance, and you need more insulin to deal with the blood sugar levels, just after one night of being poorly slept. You can also see this with the immune system. For example, if you measure C-reactive protein or CRP, that this is higher, even just after one night of being poorly slept. Another important thing that happens when we're poorly slept is that we are more likely to gain weight. And the reason for this is that we are hungrier when we're poorly slept. And you can measure this in the hormone levels. So that ghrelin, which is a marker for being hungry, this is increased when we haven't slept well. And leptin, which tells us that our body is full and we don't need to eat, this is actually decreased. So over time, we start gaining weight if we regularly are not sleeping well. You can also think, when you're poorly slept, what do you want to eat? Are you eating broccolis and vegetables? Or are you more going for sugary things and anything that gives you quick energy, caffeine, etc.? And this is something that also happens when we are poorly slept. Finally, the sympathetic and parasympathetic system are in imbalance when we're poorly slept, so that we have a higher sympathetic activity than we should have, because typically when we sleep, we are getting more relaxation and more activity from the parasympathetic, and then we can measure higher blood pressure. And this, of course, is also causing stress on the cardiovascular system, and you are then more likely to get heart disease. I'm not showing you this to scare you and think if you don't sleep well for one night, you will get all of these issues, but it really just highlights the role of sleep for all of the organs and parts of the body. If we look a little bit into acute sleep deprivation, of course, this is not typically what people are doing. This is more what we do for research. But it's not long since, for example, in hospitals, that MDs had to do shifts that were 36 hours, and this would justify as acute sleep deprivation. You're basically not sleeping for a whole night and the next whole day. And this is, of course, very detrimental to cognitive abilities. It affects all of the processes, as we were talking about in the slides before. And what happens when you finally sleep is we get rebound sleep. And this is then mostly deep sleep and then REM sleep that we get a rebound of, which really shows how crucial the deep sleep and REM sleep is for our bodily functions, that we have an increase of them if we miss out on sleep. This doesn't mean that you are then in balance again. People sometimes say, so if I sleep poorly for 5 nights, I only sleep for 5 hours, and then I just sleep for 10 hours over the weekend, and I'm fine, right? And I tend to tell people an example then that this is similar to having hamburgers, McDonald's or whatever, for 5 days, and then eating vegetables for 2. And of course, this is better than having hamburgers for 7 days, but there's still an effect of having eaten or slept poorly for 5 days, even if you then eat or sleep well for 2 days. So of course, it is better overall to always have enough sleep, even though this is maybe not, it's not humanly possible to have this at every single day, but we can prioritize it. There used to be in the Guinness World Records that you could have a sleep deprivation record. So in the 1950s and 1960s, there were guys who actually broke these records. First in 1959, Peter Tripp, he stayed awake for 8 days, 201 hours, and he was being recorded and monitored the whole time, so he did not sleep at all. And 5 years later, Randy Gardner, he actually stayed awake for 11 days or 264 hours. So he was the world champion in being able to stay awake. But this is not performed anymore. And the reason is we could see quite well in those studies and in studies after this that there's a huge issue with short-term memory. We could see a lot of issues with anger, paranoia, hallucinations, and confusion. And in Tripp, they could actually see permanent personality changes after he did this. He became quite irritable and depressed. He divorced 3 times and couldn't hold a job after doing this. Of course, we can't say for sure that this is the causality here, but there seem to have been some changes after his being awake for 8 days. Gardner, he actually thought he was a world-famous soccer player on day 4 and stayed like this for some days and was quite confused the whole time. But then he slept for some 20-something hours when he finished his wake challenge and was fine after that. So he didn't have any permanent damage from this. But these studies showed quite well that this is not something we should strive for. So this is not a Guinness record anymore. So based on these studies and a number of research that has been done, how to pull an all-nighter, which is quite common in young people, basically we're saying just do not do that. This is very bad for your learning. This is the worst thing you can do before an exam, for example. One example for acute sleep deprivation is a disease called fatal familial insomnia. Luckily, this is a very rare disease because it is a fatal inherited disease or disorder, which is characterized by progressive insomnia. So the people who have this, they start sleeping less and less. It includes deficits in attention and memory, followed by a dreamlike, confused state. So some like REM is intruding upon wake. people start to have loss of control of their autonomic nervous system and endocrine system. Their body temperature is increased, and there's insomnia. So there is the question whether insomnia is the reason for death in this case, but it's very hard to know because there are huge changes all across the brain, and brain structures getting little by little destroyed. But this is quite often shown in books and movies, but as I say, it's quite uncommon. The more typical thing, and what 1/4 of the general population is doing on a regular basis, is to sleep for, on average, maybe 4 to 6 hours, so less than the recommended sleep amount. And if we do this in the sleep laboratory, that we are shortening the sleep for 2 to 14 days, we can see that people are hungrier. And in 2 weeks, you can actually see the weight gain that happens when people are sleeping this little. You can see an increase in the blood pressure, so the stress system or the sympathetic system is in overdrive. You can see the insulin resistance, and this is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. You can measure the inflammation and the changes in the immune system, and we can also see an increase in pain sensation. We didn't talk about this before. And if I would measure you today, we would put one example of how to measure this is to put your hand into ice cold water and see how long you can stay there. And if I measure you when you're well slept, and then again when you have slept for 4 to 6 hours, you can spend less time in the ice cold water because we experience pain more when we're poorly slept. So you can think about the implications for this for hospital stays, etc., where people often get not great sleep because they're being awakened by staff and devices across the night. There are things we can do to get the hospital stays and sleep there better without affecting the security of the patients. Something we can talk about in one of the sessions if you're interested. We also see an increase in sleepiness, moodiness, and fatigue, just after these, even after 2 days. If we then consider how this, so it's one thing to be in the sleep laboratory, and these are then healthy people who choose normally to sleep longer. That typically we get people in who are normally sleep the recommended hours, 7 to 9, and then you sleep deprive them. And then you wonder, are the people who choose to do this in the society, that they report that they regularly sleep less than 6 hours, are these any different? Or do you see the same results here as for the sleep lab studies? And interestingly, we do. There is an increased risk of obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease in those who are sleeping this little, and type 2 diabetes. So this actually rhymes very well with what happens in the sleep lab. Of course, we need to remember maybe not all of these people are choosing to sleep less than 6 hours, but for some reason in their life, they are not able to sleep more than this. And there's also increased risk of death of any cause. As we mentioned before, sleeping more than 9 hours may not be beneficial. This was in the sleep stage lecture. And people who are sleeping more than 9 hours, they are more likely to be depressed, suffer from long-term illness like cancer, and people who are sick, they need to sleep more. So that there can be there's a likely connection there. The human factor in accidents is also often due to sleepiness. You can see if you watched the Chernobyl shows or looked at what happened around the Chernobyl accident, as that these people were shift workers. They were finishing a shift work schedule that was quite demanding, so they were quite tired. You can also see this, for example, in medical staff when they're driving home from the shift, that they're more likely to be in accidents, car crashes, etc. So it's something that we really need to think about to reduce accident risk, think about sleepiness. And if we talk a little bit about daytime sleepiness, this is a common problem. It's a minimum of 1 out of every 10, so 10% of the population at any given time describes having daytime sleepiness. You can define it differently based on experience, based on objective measurements. We'll talk about that more in part 2. But there are many different reasons for someone to have sleepiness. So it may be because they're sleeping too little. It may be because of sleep disorders. It can also be because of other diseases and medication. A lot of medication can also induce sleepiness. for example, many of the drugs in psychiatry. Daytime sleepiness is a quality of life issue, so it is important to address it and the risk of accidents. So, to finish this part, this is your assignment. Consider why people may choose to sleep deprive themselves. Why would you choose to sleep deprive yourself? People in your family that you know are not sleeping enough. Do you think it's always a choice? Or when will we see that people are sleeping less than they should? And what are the reasons for it? I wanted to end this part with a personal anecdote. So when I was 13 years old, I was asked in the school newspaper, what is the purpose of life? This is in Icelandic on top, and then I translated it to English. And this is a picture of me, and I said to have fun and sleep. So I am one of those people who has always loved her sleep, and I've always felt it is very important for me, at least, to sleep well. Thank you.